Please welcome on stage, with a big round of applause, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Patrick French, and Supriya Nair.
Hi, everyone.
Earlier this year, we lost a literary legend, Nobel Prize winner, and a man who explored questions of place and identity. For more than half a century, V.S. Naipaul. To talk about Naipaul, his life, career, and how he cast a steely eye on the shards of empire in a series of novels and travelogues. Patrick French, historian, is the author of internationally acclaimed The World is What It Is, the authorized biography of V.S. Naipaul. He also penned several books, such as India, a Portrait, Tibet, a personal history of a lost land, Liberty or Death, etc. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, second-term Member of Parliament and Chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, is also an award-winning author of 17 books, including the great Indian novel, Inglorious Empire, and Why I Am a Hindu. The Paradoxical Prime Minister is his most recent publication. Supriya Nair is a journalist and editor from Mumbai. She writes about books, culture, and sports. Her work has appeared in the Atlantic, Wisdom, and N+1. She's currently a sports columnist for Mumbai Mirror.
Thank you. Hi, it's lovely to see you all here, and it's my great privilege to be in conversation with two great writers, historians, and in Patrick's case, the biographer of V.S. Naipaul. We're very fortunate that the organizers have titled this session Remembering V.S. Naipaul, because then we get to make this quite personal and speak not only to two writers, but also to two readers about their relationship with Naipaul and how that's affected them as writers and how that's changed over time. Should we start with you, Dr. Tharoor?
Sure. I mean, I'm the reader, whereas Patrick is actually, he knew Naipaul and knows him intimately. So I think he's the authority on the subject and I'm just the guy who reads. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, let's start with that. When did you first discover V.S. Naipaul? Do you remember the first book you read by him?
Yeah, I mean, I was too young probably to fully appreciate Naipaul. I read An Era of Darkness in my teens. I beg your pardon, An Area of Darkness. Mine was, you see. Yeah. Anyway.
Nicely done.
And predictably, I suppose, I was outraged and offended by all the things he
This was when you were a student in India.
I was a student in India, and I thought this was deeply offensive and borderline racist, though, of course, he belonged to the same race in as much as that means anything. And subsequently, quite by accident, I discovered the Caribbean novels and loved them. I mean, Mystic Maser and Suffrage of Elvira in particular, I found delightful and so different from the curmudgeonly, dyspeptic tone of the nonfiction that I realized there were more dimensions, thank you so much, there were more dimensions to Naipaul than perhaps just reading his nonfiction would indicate. And then came books that, one started reading as they were new. I was asked, I remember, to review Among the Believers by the Illustrated Weekly at the time.
This is a book about traveling
through Islamic countries. And I enjoyed the writing, but didn't like many of the hasty conclusions he drew from his writing. So, if he sees a truck in Pakistan with only one light shining at night, he blames it somehow on Islam, which is a bit absurd, I thought, and said so in my review. And I must say the four others I read, I sort of tapered off. Unlike Patrick, I haven't read every word of his. I read the sequel, Beyond Belief, which I reviewed for the Washington Post. And I read India, A Million Mutinies Now.
Right.
Now, in all of that, and I read a book called North-South, which was his extraordinarily kind take on the racism of the southern United States, which is something he published, and deservedly forgotten book in the first decade of the 21st century. In fact, a pretty bad book, I thought, because he was all the dyspepsia that he had reserved for the lesser breeds of the world, the browner people, and the blacker ones, were completely absent as he lovingly detailed the prejudices of white Southerners in America. It was quite bizarre. But anyway, so my problems with Naipaul were essentially two or threefold. There's no doubt that he's a master of the English language and of prose. There's no doubt about his searing intelligence. He just doesn't seem to be a nice guy, in that he seemed to react to people he met and frankly used with as much of unkindness as people could muster. Mm-hmm. He describes many of these people, sometimes by their real names, which is not very kind either. He draws, in my view, very sweeping conclusions from very scanty evidence, so that, as I say, I mean, to blame on Islam everything wrong in an Islamic country, from the fact that a carpet doesn't fit in a lift to as I said, a hanging tail light in a
bad meal he's
lorry,
having,
or a bad meal he's having,
said.
Seemed to me a bit much. And then the final thing about India in particular was the number of howlers one comes across when he writes about India, which then inform his conclusions. Now, Patrick and I were just briefly chatting with you as we came up here, and he makes the point that the larger insights are still valuable, and I don't disagree with that. But I mentioned, for example, when I read India, a million mutinies now, I literally catalogued a couple of dozen outrageous mistakes. I mean, really basic mistakes that any Indian friend reading his manuscript could have corrected. And one of them, as I mentioned too, was when he has this long conversation with somebody in Calcutta who keeps speaking about the corporation, which is the way in which Calcuttans refer to the municipal authorities of Calcutta. But from this, Naipaul, completely misunderstanding his interlocutor, goes into an entire riff about how Indians are hopeless at corporate things and how the corporate entity of Indian society doesn't work, which is, I mean, it's just one example of many. And I kept thinking that the technique is therefore at fault. You go off, you read something or very little about the place you're going to, you meet a half a dozen people or a dozen people, you observe them shrewdly and acutely, but there are natural limitations to how much you glean from them, and then you draw these magnificently sweeping conclusions.
Right. So your feeling is that he's a poor foreign correspondent. But I have to ask, if it weren't for those wonderful early novels, and if you'd only read An Area of Darkness, would you still have continued to read him?
No, probably not. I mean, the only thing is, of course, no, you would have read him because he was taken so seriously. It was after see, I put it very bluntly. If you're a curious reader, you want to know what people are reading around you.
This is true.
And so if you get somebody getting an awful lot of attention in the literary pages, you would probably want to find out what it was all about, if a theme was interesting enough. So I would probably have read Naipaul because he was undoubtedly hailed, as Patrick has done, as one of the great writers of the century. So you can't be completely oblivious to his work.
Right.
But I never felt excited enough to read everything, and most of what I read, I'm afraid, I didn't like.
Right. And it wasn't just Patrick, but the Nobel Committee that decided that he was one of our living legends. Patrick, I want to come to the question of what made you say yes to becoming Naipaul's biographer. But before that, I want to know, as Dr. T said, what your relationship with him as a reader was.
Well, I mean, I always say yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be on stage here talking at the Times of India Literature Festival. And remembering the days
10 years ago.
And also remembering the days of literary pages. I mean, weren't those great days when all newspapers had literary pages, and then you could decide, I better read this person because they're being elevated by reviewers and critics. But can I just start by saying that, we're here to remember V.S. Naipaul, who in every respect had an utterly remarkable life. Being born in poverty in colonial Trinidad in 1932 as the grandchild of indentured laborers, people who effectively had been taken into slavery and sent from northern UP to Trinidad. And out of that extraordinarily unpromising circumstance in which very few people from his community, the East Indian West Indians, were literate, he went from there to a scholarship to Oxford. Very broken family circumstances. His father, during his childhood, who was actually quite a good writer himself, self-taught, somebody who basically knew the creolized version of Bhojpuri spoken in the sugar belt of central Trinidad. His father taught himself English. So out of this completely inauspicious circumstance, he goes on to get the knighthood and to get the Booker Prize and get the Nobel Prize and become, as Shashi says, whether you like his politics or not, to become one of the great writers in the English language of the later 20th century. I've forgotten the questions.
Sorry, but I think it's quite striking that Naipaul left what could arguably called a form of special pleading for him to his biographers and never wanted to do any of it himself.
No, but I didn't do any special pleading. All I did was represent the facts as I found them in the archives, Supriya.
If I were in a bad mood, I would say that you were special pleading right now, but I'm not. I'm delighted to be here speaking to you. My question was about you as a reader of Naipaul.
Okay, so I approached him as a reader. I don't remember. I think I may have started with The House of Mr. Biswas, or possibly the India books. I remember reading A Bend in the River.
This was when you were a student yourself.
Yeah, but I remember, I probably would have been in my late teens. And then I read A Bend in the River, and I remember thinking that was an extraordinarily powerful book. Again, a kind of prophetic book, given what went wrong in the Congo, in Zaire, as it then was, quite soon after the book was published. And then I guess I slightly put him to one side. And then I met him in Wiltshire, in rural England, in, I guess, the late 1990s. So that was the approximate trajectory.
Why did you stop your biography in 96 with the death of his wife and this rather abrupt remarriage and not go on to the later years?
So I mean, I may at some future point go on to the successive years, but what I felt really was that his writing career, his life, his thought, his analysis of these very complex problems around colonialism, post-colonialism, slavery, economic imbalances between different countries, all these questions he addresses, in a productive literary sense, they kind of stopped around the time of his wife Patricia's death, his remarriage. I mean, I don't feel that anybody, even his staunchest admirers, would say that his last few books were his best books. A lot of people feel, and I have quite a lot of sympathy, in fact, with what Shashi said about those very early books set in the Caribbean, these kind of comic novels. Those first 4 books, they are absolutely joyful and wonderful. I mean, a book like Miguel Street, you can read to children and they laugh out loud. And then you move from that to something like In a Free State, where you put it down and want to go and put a cold compress on your head and take a rest and put the blinds down. I mean, it goes through these various stages. Yeah.
But that also meant that you couldn't cover something that's anticipated by various people through the biography, which is his inevitable Nobel.
Right. I mean, the thing is
I covered that in the introduction.
But you see, the book was published in the biography. The World Is What It Is was published in I think 2008, and I just felt at that point there was no point in trying to take it up to 2006, 2007. I mean, the conceptual break was 1996, and I thought if at a later date I want to do a sequel, then that would remain an option.
Right. And you always knew that he was going to be honest with you to the degree that he was and allow you into... Because one of the reasons Patrick's biography is perhaps one of the most extraordinary works of biography published in this century, maybe in any century, is just the degree of honesty with which it addresses Naipaul's personal life and what some would call his serious failings.
Yeah. Okay, so just to take that point, I mean, I only agreed to write the biography on the condition that I could have full access to his archives. And he had archived himself from the days when he was a schoolboy. He would keep his letters, he would keep his exam papers, everything was there. And also I insisted on having access to him to ask him about the more painful and difficult and, in some ways quite tragic periods of his life. And he agreed to that. And what was really extraordinary is that even when I found out things that were deeply shocking and upsetting, he always spoke about it frankly. He never tried to make himself seem like a good guy. He never made excuses of saying, oh, this is why I did this bad thing to my wife or to my lover or to my friend. He always exposed himself. And it's a very rare thing, I think, for anybody, even posthumously, to be able to say, take me in the round and look at me for all my failings. And that is what happened. I mean, that was one of the reasons why the book's titled The World Is What It Is. He was applying those same stringent, harsh, cruel standards to himself that he applied to all of these different countries that he visited during his 60-year-long career.
I want to come back to his mania for recording and how that works both in his journalism and in his later writing. But I want to come back to Dr. Tharoor as a historian of imperialism and put to you that one of the things that really irks readers like you and I, perhaps, is that Naipaul is really unequivocally eye-openingly wonderful if you can accept the fact that he doesn't think imperialism was a fundamental crime committed upon.
Not only
upon
doesn't he think that, he seems largely oblivious to the fracturing impact of colonialism on the countries he writes about, because he actually describes them as half-formed civilizations. It's his phrase. He sees many of these countries as struggling to be something better, and the something better is the model of the metropole, is the British, for example, or the French, or the Belgians, as the case may be. And that's fundamentally wrong, because in fact it's the opposite that is true. These are half-destroyed civilizations that are struggling to reassert themselves, both in terms of an authentic connection to their own pre-colonial past, and in rising through the institutions, processes, languages, and so on, left behind by the colonial impact. So the fundamental flaw in Naipaul's analysis is that he literally reverses, he sees it, as it were, in the wrong mirror. To speak about these countries as half-formed civilizations trying to be something else, rather than half-destroyed civilizations trying to reassert themselves, starts you off on a completely wrong premise as far as I'm concerned. And that is something that affects very much my reading of Naipaul.
Yeah.
I mean, Patrick is right about the fiction as well. In a Free State, I gather, won the recent poll amongst all the Booker books of the first 50 years or something, all the Booker winners, first 50 years, and I'm quite shocked by that, because I didn't at all
It's
enjoy
not even
that.
his best novel. It's not even his best novel.
Well, I don't know what his best novel. Many people love the Bend in the River as fiction and as writing, but I honestly disliked the tone, the concerns, the politics of the book so much. It was difficult. I mean, one of the difficulties I have with Naipaul is that to really like something, you have to some degree, empathize with either the author or the characters. Now, maybe this is a purely personal take on my part, but whereas that empathy was possible in the early Caribbean books, I found it impossible to empathize with the sensibility of the later books, both fiction and non-fiction.
Yeah.
Not that I've read all the fiction, I haven't, and I'm glad I didn't read the later.
Well, I'm
books
no,
that
I'm no
Patrick was
completist either, but I agree with you. But I feel like maybe there's also a more complicated way to look at this, Patrick. This instinctive dislike that people like readers like Dr. Tharoor and I may have for someone who doesn't write with the kind of empathy that we think is necessary to understand societies like ours. Doesn't necessarily also relegate him to, kind of like like a Victorian writing 100 years after his time, right?
Well, I mean, a couple of points here. I mean, where are the examples in Naipaul's writing where he writes in complementary terms about the colonial or imperial experience? What he does do is analyze post-colonial societies in a very, very harsh light, which is something that I think is a little bit different. And I would argue that in terms of his thinking about those societies, particularly societies that have been destroyed by slavery, I mean, that's the thing that he writes particularly interestingly about. When he says that those countries are, in the post-colonial era, half-made, he's also saying they are half-destroyed. I would actually suggest that his philosophy is fairly similar to that of Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth. It's just that because Naipaul comes from this sort of high Mandarin anglicized style, it isn't perceived in that way.
Well, the other thing is also that Fanon is a revolutionary, and you never really get the sense from Naipaul's work that he's interested in... I mean, another person in his position might have become a Marxist, or many people from the Caribbean did, many scholars and thinkers, and he rejected the left.
He did, but
altogether, right?
the point about this is that he was somebody who liked to provoke. He was a great practitioner of what in Trinidad is called piquant, which comes from the same root word as piquant, in other words, piercing. He liked to wind people up. He liked to abrade. And maybe that's what a writer should be doing. I'm not certain that you should love characters, find them sympathetic. I think there are a lot of great characters in literature who you think, I would not want to meet that person. And in fact, there's very much this idea that, this series couldn't be made or this book shouldn't be published because the characters are not sympathetic. you don't really want to sit in a warm bath with the characters in a novel.
Sometimes you do.
You want to be provoked by somebody's writing. I mean, look, for example, when he passed away earlier this year, there was a very interesting comment that Arundhati Roy made, saying that I would take it as a great compliment if people said my writing was as powerful as Naipaul's, but coming from exactly the opposite political direction. So I think that, often very good writers do offend, annoy, and provoke and irritate.
And perhaps, right, and many people, I mean, Arundhati Roy herself offends and annoys and provokes and irritates. But Naipaul kind of stood alone. And, however provocative Arundhati Roy may be, I think this is what happens when you align yourself with the left, right, or leftist politics. You become part of a collective. You belong somewhere. And I think that the sense that we don't get from Naipaul at all is that he's interested in belonging to anywhere.
In fact, from Patrick's biography, you do get the sense that he rather relished the fact that he didn't care whether people liked him or not. And he almost went out of his way to ensure that they wouldn't like him. Everything that I remember from Patrick's account of his personal life, and certainly what I know of people he used on his visits to India and abused thereafter, both in private correspondence, some of which Patrick quotes, and in published accounts. All of that, as I say, doesn't suggest a man who's nice to know. But in a sense, that is a different issue. It's a different order of problem. In other words, if the individual is a nonconformist, doesn't want to be liked, doesn't want to belong, that ultimately is only his own problem. It's not necessarily ours, provided the work stands for itself. Now, I partly disagreed, Patrick, that with fiction I do believe some degree of empathy. I didn't say sympathy. Empathy is required. With non-fiction, that's not required. Non-fiction, it's an intellectual exercise. You either agree with the approach and the argument, or you don't. And I found myself disagreeing far more than I did agreeing. Now, yet, the man wrote remarkable prose, right? I mean, he could wield a sentence with great precision and acuity. There was an ability to... there were piercing insights, no question about it.
He'd make you squirm.
I was bothered by the things I disagreed with, but that meant that perhaps in my irritation I was overlooking a lot of other things. And Patrick did make that point earlier, that with something like Million Mutinies Now, that there were small things to be really irritated about, but the big analysis was right. And maybe that's a ground we can tread, because ultimately, for the kind of writing Naipaul did, if it's going to be enduring and lasting, if it's going to be read 50 years from now, it's got to illuminate its times. And I think the question is, does it do so sufficiently? Or do these flaws that I've described drag it down from that?
Yeah. Would you like to take that?
Yes, I think that's right, exactly. Any good writer has to illuminate their times. So, there are bits, for example, in Area of Darkness, which in retrospect you can say they were offensive, but there was a kind of a larger truth contained in them. In the same way in A Million Mutinies Now, he anticipates all these acts of rebellion, which really resulted, I guess, sort of within the subsequent decade, the 1990s, in this complete reshaping of how Indian politics works. Again, I referred to A Bend in the River, the kind of prophetic aspect of the way that he wrote about Congo or Zaire. And I suppose you get it a bit, actually, even in the book that you referred to, the one set in the American South, whose name escapes me.
I think it was called
A Turn in the South. A Turn in the South.
Oh, A Turn in the South.
I think North South
That
was
is
Shiva Naipaul's
novel.
And it's one of his weakest books, I would agree. But even when he interviews the people who describe themselves in the book as rednecks, white nationalists, poor white Americans, exactly the kind of people who today we would see as Donald Trump voters. Again, he's picking up a phenomenon and saying, these people who everybody jeers at and ignores, maybe there's something interesting stirring here. Again, if you look at Among the Believers, published in 1982, he says, radical Islam is a grave global political threat. A lot of the reviews that came out of that earlier book, because Beyond Belief was a sequel, but when that book came out in 1982, a lot of reviewers said this is ridiculous. How could Islam, a religion, become a political force? What is he talking about? So you get these moments where you think he may be offending people. He may sometimes get a few details wrong here and there, but there's something in the air. There's some larger truth that he seems to be getting hold of. And just to give one example where I'm sort of in agreement with the error, the moment that he lands in Bombay for the first time in 1962 or 1961, he's 29 years old. He's never been to the land of his ancestors. He's never been to India. And he gets off the ship at Sassoon docks, and a tout basically comes and asks for cheese. Has he got anything that could be sold? And Naipaul takes this as meaning Cheese. And he says, oh, in India they don't know how to make cheese. And they're asking me if I can give them some cheese. And, that would be a prime example of where he's missing the thing, right? So, somebody who travels very widely, globally, in the way that he does, perhaps doesn't have the internet to check whether or not he's made a factual error. There are those kind of mistakes, for sure. They are there.
And yet, in spite of him being a thorn in the sides of thousands of Indian readers, he's influenced generations of Indian writers. Male Indian writers, I think. I can't think of a single woman who willingly aligns herself to the Naipauline. How did that happen? Can we talk about that? Yeah.
Well, I missed that influence, so
yeah.
If
anything, you're writing. If anything, you're writing against
but I
your.
think certainly, sort of someone like Pankaj Mishra shows a strong trace of influence.
I think he's no.
I don't mean in terms of the politics.
Right.
He's obviously a very different set of, but the style and the approach seems to have been inspired to some degree by that.
I think both Pankaj and Teju Cole, who's a Nigerian-American writer, are people who started off as great readers of Naipaul and then became his critics, or rejected him in some way. But
Atish Tasir also has been influenced, I think, by V.S. Naipaul's writing.
Who was?
Atish Tasir.
Has he?
I think Atish is another one, very, very true. And he actually has a Naipaul character in one of his novels, very thinly disguised.
That must have been flat,
before
right?
the current one, the one about his.
Right.
That's the way it was.
The way things were.
The way things were.
Right.
One, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're right. There is that, but you see, the influence is simply, I suppose, that he was the giant figure of Indian ethnicity in the world of English letters, and that would inevitably make something you would turn towards. I suppose for a later generation, Rushdie may have occupied that spot. And there are many writers inspired by Rushdie as well, as you can see in terms of style and in terms of concern. So it's not surprising that if somebody who kind of looks like you, as it were, or hails from a similar ethnic origin,
And writes
is
with
making
authority
it very
about your
big
milieu.
internationally, you tend, understandably, to look up to that person and to derive some sustenance intellectually or stylistically or otherwise from that right. I don't think it's more than that. But I think that since I accidentally mentioned the Shiva Naipaul title, Shiva Naipaul was himself a very interesting example of somebody who took the same technique, but I think made more of it. I mean, it's very North of South is indeed the book I was. I used the wrong title for V.S. Naipaul, but Shiva Naipaul's North of South Africa. He travels to 4 or 5 countries. The formula is exactly the same as his brothers. He reads one work or two that he is told would be typical of that civilization. He meets half a dozen people. He travels impressionistically, and then he writes. But there's something, in my view, almost of a higher quality, and certainly of greater empathy in Shiva Naipaul's writing. The man died very young, so we'll never quite know what he could have become.
Kind of apparently
but
emotionally
those
strangled.
couple of books he wrote, I thought, stand up rather well for the use of this technique. Whereas Naipaul, perhaps because he used a technique so often in so many books, shows up the limitations of the technique very greatly.
Yeah. I think Shiva is definitely a writer's writer for many like you. One of the other things, Dr. T, is of course the influence of Naipaul on you is, there's no question of that, because in some ways your writing works at the interstices of academia and popular writing. And my sense of, I haven't read everything by Naipaul, but I don't think he ever had truck with the social sciences in any meaningful way. I think Ravi Dayal tells you, right? Oh, we were publishing so much great stuff about Amartya Sen. We were publishing Amartya Sen and the great historians, and he had absolutely no interest in any of that. Yeah, that's right. I'm interested in something Dr. Tharoor said about a certain fashion for Naipaul that, and his influence being replaced by that of Rushdie, perhaps for another generation. Can you tell us about what it was like to see the critical consensus on Naipaul change over time? He appears in the 50s, for example, and is very well received in the UK, right? Quite a phenomenon.
Yes and no. He was published, but also the way that he was received in the 1950s was patronizing, it was racist, it was limiting, it was thinking that he was a curiosity from a hot island in the West Indies. It wasn't really until the 1960s, particularly with the House of Mr. Biswas, that he's really taken seriously as a, potentially at least a major writer. The other thing to remember...
His first major award was for Mr. Stone and the Knight's Companion, wasn't it? The first major award was for a book that wasn't set in the Caribbean, Mr. Stone and the Knight's Companion.
No, but I mean in terms of people reviewing him as being something more than a curiosity.
Serious,
yeah, and essentially saying Mr. Biswas and Naipaul is the equivalent of Dickens or is the equivalent of Hardy. In other words, this is a great 19th century novel, but it happens to be set in the Caribbean. So that thing of him being taken seriously begins in the 60s, it shades into the 1970s, and what is extraordinary at that time is really the scale of his ambition. It's fine if you're writing subsequently to say, well, I will be writing within the tradition of the post-colonial novel, but there was no such thing as the post-colonial novel. It was a form that had to be invented. When he went to the BBC in the 1950s to try to come off the colonial service and go on to the mainstream things like the Home Service or the Light Programme, purely for racist reasons, he was not allowed in the door. He was not allowed to do that. So he was working against very substantial adversity for the 1950s, for the 1960s. By the 70s, the politics starts to change. But I think a lot of the, let's say, the insulting side of Naipaul comes out of that hurt. It comes out of that wound of his early life and his early career. By the 1970s, people are sort of loving and hating him at the same time. He's being widely admired, but there's also, let's say, a critical idea that somehow he is not playing the same political game as a lot of other people. You mentioned the popularity of Marxism at the time when he was emerging as a writer. A lot of the people who he knew well, who'd come out of the Caribbean in his generation, were tending towards the left. They were tending towards Marxism. So therefore, partly for sort of deliberately contradictory reasons, he decided to do the exact opposite. He did not want to be part of any consensus or any group. By the 1990s, I'd say there was a sort of critical swing against him. But really in the early years of the 20th century...
Sorry, could you tell us why that was?
I mean,
was he an old racist by that time?
I don't think it was so much that in the 90s as the fact that, there is a critical consensus which goes in favor of certain books. Particular writers go in and out of fashion. I mean, at the moment I'm writing the biography of the novelist Doris Lessing, and you can see that, again, she had a very long career. And you see moments when the sort of book she was writing, let's say The Golden Notebook in the mid-60s, this is the book to write. But by the time you get to the 1980s, it's dated and it's past and it's forgotten. And so, writers go up and they go down. But I'd say with Naipaul, there was a moment in the early 2000s when suddenly a lot of writers, critics, began to say, this is somebody who has done something remarkable. And in fact, Teju Cole would be a very good example of a new generation of writer approaching Naipaul in a different way. So,
sorry, who
Teju Cole.
Teju Cole.
Yes.
Yeah, I suppose to someone writing now, they might look back at Rushdie and think that, oh, this is a bit dated. So these things go through cycles. I don't want to dwell in great detail on the India books, particularly because I sense that our audience will have some questions for you both on that. But one aspect that I want to provoke you both about is the sense that emerges out of them that then goes on to serve Naipaul's public image in the West, that he is, that he's Brahminical, that he is who he is because he is Brahmin, and he seems to have enjoyed that. Did he work to give people in the West a sense that he was, this austere, fastidious, that he was who he was because he was actually an upper caste Indian?
Yeah, I mean, I think he did do that. He didn't do it explicitly, but he certainly allowed and liked it when other people said that on his behalf. But the thing that I determined in the book, by going to Trinidad, by going to the archives, by interviewing people, was the fact that he did not necessarily come from a Brahmin
From Brahmin ancestry.
background.
Yeah.
Very many of them didn't know really what their ancestors actually were.
Well, it's partly that people didn't know. It's partly that his maternal family, they were definitely UP Brahmins from Gorakhpur. So that, there's very strong evidence for that. But, traditionally these things come down the male line, and on his father's side there's no certainty at all. And if you think of the way in which women in particular in the 1880s, in the 1890s, became indentured laborers and were shipped to the Caribbean, they were often people who had been rejected from very tough parts of society. But I think that because he was trying to fashion and remake himself in a different country, in the England of the 1950s and 60s, the idea that he could, in some vague ancestral way, come from this elite Brahminical ancestry was an idea that I think appealed to him, and it gave him a sort of a sense of claimed identity. They actually have a great phrase in Trinidad, which is Brahmin by boat, and that means somebody who acquires the caste status during the sea voyage from Calcutta to Port of Spain.
There are two anecdotes I'd like to share. One is from Patrick's book and one is not, about this sort of Napoleon arrogance or Brahminism or whatever. Patrick talks about, I think, an incident in an elevator when he's coming down with the famous writer Auberon Waugh. And Auberon Waugh says something along the lines of, everyone calls you VS, what's your name? And this guy says, it's Vidya Naipaul. So Auberon Waugh says, may I call you Vidya? And Naipaul says, no, since we've only just met, you may call me Mr. Naipaul. First of all, is arrogant in the extreme, but the fact that it's directed to a white man gives it a particularly delicious twist, I think. Sorry, Patrick, I don't mean that to be offensive, as offensive as it sounds.
But also, and the fact that it's addressed to the upper class son of Evelyn Waugh.
Exactly.
That makes it even more piquant.
That's more piquant. Yeah. But the second anecdote is not in your book, because it really is not an anecdote about Naipaul at all, except that the story is. I heard this, by the way, from the host in question. Naipaul, of course, part of this Brahminical disdain was a very expressionless face. I think many of you must have heard this. But the story goes that there was a big literary party in New York, and the host told me the story, so I believe the story. And there was this one chap who was determined to prove that the writer Ved Mehta, who wrote regularly for the New Yorker, was blind. And who was blind, I beg your pardon, was actually not blind, because Ved Mehta is one of these writers who overcompensates for his handicap by going in for extremely unnecessary visual descriptions. Yeah. So in Ved Mehta's books, you won't come across somebody, he meets somebody and he says, he was wearing, I don't know, beige trousers and a green shirt or whatever. He'll keep mentioning details that are completely irrelevant to what the conversation is or the issues are. Right. But the importance of the visual coming from a blind writer is particularly striking. And so this other guest at the party was determined to prove that Ved Mehta really wasn't blind. Right. So he asks his host, so where is Ved Mehta? So Ved Mehta said, in that inner living room, on these Park Avenue apartments with several living rooms, and that living room is sitting on the edge of a sofa. So this guy, who's an American, is leaving the party an hour or so later, and he comes to the host and says, I'm sorry, you're right, Ved Mehta is blind. So the guy says, what do you mean? He said, well, I went and stood at the doorway to that room, directly across from this guy sitting on the edge of the sofa, this Indian writer, and I started making faces at him. And I twiddled my thumbs, and I opened my eyes, and I stuck my tongue out, and so on. And his expression never changed. So I guess you're right, he's blind. He couldn't see a thing. The guy said, you fool, Ved Mehta left the minute after you entered. That was V.S. Naipaul.
Okay, I'm going to be generous and devote lots of time to audience questions because I sense there'll be many of you over here who have a bone to pick with V.S. Naipaul, if not with Patrick and Dr. Tharoor. But I also have other questions to ask, so I reserve the right to take the mic away from you at some point. Just a minute, please. I will pick who the questioner will be. And sir in the center, wearing the jacket. Yes, thank you. We can't hear you, sir.
There is another mic.
Yeah, we have another mic if you're...
Patrick, your views on Enigma of Arrival.
On the Enigma of Arrival, a late Naipaul work.
None of you have spoken about that book.
So I think The Enigma of Arrival is a book that tends to be loved more by writers than by readers. It's quite a complex book. It's really about somebody who's a sort of thinly disguised version of V.S. Naipaul moving from Trinidad to rural southwest England. And one of the strange things about Enigma of Arrival was that I happened to know the physical setting and the landscape of that book extremely well because it's in the area around Stonehenge where I lived as a child. And what was absolutely bizarre is that when he writes about Wiltshire, he writes about Devizes, he writes about Salisbury, he writes about these little villages around Stonehenge, it is absolutely uncanny how accurate and how precise it is. It's almost as if he's completely inside that world and that society. So, I mean, I think it's an absolutely astonishing book. I'd be interested, in fact, to know what the questioner makes of it. But it's not an easy, straightforward book. It's almost like a technical guide to brilliant writing.
I've read most of his books, and I think this is his most outstanding book.
So you're in agreement. Thank you.
I'm in agreement with you. This is perhaps his best book of the lot.
Yes. Sorry, I heard a woman's voice saying that she had a question.
And the way he emotes is fantastic.
Can we get a mic up to the balcony? Is that impossible? Sorry, until we can, I'd like to pick sir in the second row with the pink collar. Well chosen.
Good afternoon, all. This question is directed to Mr. Tharoor. So I wanted to ask you that V.S. Naipaul was from Indian origin, but lived in Trinidad and Tobago. Do you think that his work, in a way, propagated Indian soft power, that no author was able to do it because of his works?
No, because first of all, his initial books were not about India. His first book about India was an area of darkness which did a lot of damage to India's soft power because we were busy trying to promote ourselves as a great civilization, and here he described this horrendous society with people shitting everywhere.
Was it a drain inspector's report?
Yeah, it was a drain inspector's report, to quote Gandhiji, on Catherine Mayer. So he certainly wasn't an asset to India's soft power. Then he went off and wrote other books that had nothing to do with India and achieved global renown. But then he came back and wrote An India Wounded Civilization, which again undermined India's soft power. So he turned on India only with his third book, India, Million Mutinies Now, which was much more kind and gentle about how the future of India looked bright and exciting and promising. But by then, I think he had done so much damage to India's soft power that to actually put him on the positive side of that particular ledger would be tough.
Dr. T, do you have any fellow politicians who are devotees of Naipaul?
I haven't come across any. To be honest, we don't, I know people may not fully believe this, but the only politician I've really discussed books with is Rahul Gandhi. He reads. A lot of people in our politics don't read.
Yeah. That I don't know about, but I believe you. And he hasn't read Naipaul, I presume.
He reads a lot of non-fiction, so I've only discussed non-fiction with him.
Right.
But I would ask him one day whether he's read Naipaul, at least Naipaul's fiction as well, because when I think about the soft power argument, we've only become conscious of the way in which Indians are perceived around the world through literature. Quite recently, I take some immodest credit for first talking about soft power in the Indian context with the blessings of the originator of the theory, Joseph Nair, when I started applying his theoretical framework to India. And I used literature and Bollywood and our soap operas and our films and our yoga and all of that as the components, as the embodiments of that soft power. But honestly, I would not have included Naipaul in that, not least because he's only Indian ethnically. There's nothing terribly Indian about him in any other way, neither residence nor allegiance. I was astonished when he won the Nobel Prize and said it's an honor for Britain, my home, and India, the home of my ancestors. And I was taken aback because I'd never really expected. And of course, the Trinidadians were deeply insulted. But I think Patrick assumed that was because he was deliberately trying to needle them to have a good laugh, right?
Yeah, I bet.
Exactly. I mean, the word, he was asked, why did you not mention the land of your birth, Trinidad? And he said, I thought it might encumber the tribute. And just one more soft power point. I mean, I know that there was a visiting senior Indian diplomat who he met, I think, in Kampala, and said that there was a circus in town where there was a lion tamer, and as part of the lion's act on stage, an Indian man ran on stage and put his head inside the lion's jaws and kept it there for 10 seconds and took it out again, and the audience roared and applauded. And Naipal's suggestion was that the ICCR should send things like this around the world rather than Bharatanatyam dancers and so forth.
Of course.
Yeah.
Just a minute,
Yes.
please.
Yes,
Sir, in the...
Can I ask the question now?
Oh, you have a mic?
Yes. I do.
Fantastic. Yes,
Thank
you
you.
please.
Don't you think that the vast diversity of characters that we see in Naipaul, which is actually quite rare in writers, the kind of range of people he covers, kind of puts him above and way beyond this argument about empathy and sympathy about his books. Also, I'm a little disturbed by the amount of time we are spending on his personality rather than on his writing. It seems as if, before the British came, we were an ideal society. And we've heard, of course, Dr. Tharoor himself claim somewhere that the British were good for us. But then let's take it in the nature of satire. And
perhaps for a different
Naipaul was a master of satire for sure. And let's give him his creative due. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll
Sure,
let Patrick take that, but I will say that one of the reasons we spent some time on Naipaul's personal history is because it's really brilliantly described in Patrick's treasure of a book.
Okay, so apart from saying here to the questioner, I would just say that the one thing that he does amazingly in Biswas and in other books as well is write about the extended family and the dynamics within the extended or joint family. He does that astonishingly well. It's hard to think of any other novelist who does that.
Actually, Patrick, I must say that I have conveyed this complete lack of sympathy for Naipaul, but his letters to and from his father that Gillan Aitken edited, which I also reviewed and read, they moved me deeply and very, very. So it's not as if the man is totally unlikable. There were clearly these qualities. But coming back to your question, ma'am, just two observations, if I may. First, I've never said the British did anything good for us. I said the good things they've left behind, they didn't intend to leave for us. They were things they brought in to enhance British profits, further British dominance, or strengthen British control. They really weren't about India at all. And therefore, yes, some good has stayed on, notably cricket, tea, the English language, whatever, but they weren't intended for us. So I certainly don't see that as a particularly fair point to hang around my neck. But on the larger issue, I'd admit I've been unkind, but don't forget Patrick's is a biography. It's not just a literary appreciation of the work. It's all about the life, so that's why we were discussing the life, since that's what Patrick has written a book about.
Dr. T, I think you and Naipaul might have seen eye to eye on cricket, if nothing else. He was a fan, wasn't he?
Indeed he was.
And perhaps one of his few publicly declared allegiances was at one point to the West Indies.
Although he
cricket
supported
team.
the West Indies, exactly.
Yeah, quite
And
so.
one thing that I should have
Well,
mentioned
so did, who didn't, right?
was that in his last year at Oxford, his father's ambition for him was to join the Indian Foreign Service, which was just being set up after independence.
Oh, that's another point of...
Now, I'm not in the Indian Foreign Service
No,
either, but
but
I'm just saying that he came that close
Yeah.
to becoming an Indian diplomat, rather
diplomat.
than a Trinidadian British writer.
Quite
Well,
so.
except that he was blocked and banned, and he fictionalizes that scene in A Bend in the River. In other words, the fact that at that time, in the 70s, the fact that he was of Indian ethnicity meant nothing. So the idea of there being a larger diaspora, which is claimed or reclaimed by India, didn't really happen, I guess, until the early years of this century.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
We'll take one more. Yes, whoever has the mic. I can see that it's out of my hands now.
Amritanshu, Indian Railways.
Yes, hi. He's
Two-
up in the
Two
balcony.
questions only. I will be as clinical as possible. First to my Shashi ji.
Sorry, where, are you in the balcony or are you? Oh, okay, right.
I have been a huge fan of yours right from the college days.
Thank you.
17 already in the kitty. And I can foresee the 18th one coming up in a year or so. The fall and rise and fall of the BJP empire.
The 18th book is out. It's called The Paradoxical Prime
Maybe
Minister.
19th
and it gives
one,
you
then.
reasons why the BJP should fall.
19th will follow the 18th one, you know. Any take? And for Sir Patrick, my American padris who taught me at school had kept all the biographies in the fiction shelf. One day I inquired, Father, he said, son, otherwise they will not sell. What about your case, sir? Thank you.
Sorry, but I'm more interested in the fact that our questioner brought up the BJP, because I realized that we deliberately sidestepped the question of Naipaul and his cussed politics vis-a-vis India. Patrick, would you prefer that we passed over that? Because
No. I mean, there was an interesting moment. I think it must have been in about 2002, 2003, when there was a BJP intellectual cell, or I don't know if it's called intellectual cell, but it was connected with kind of cultural life. And he went there, and he was, let's say, less complimentary than the listeners were expecting. He was talking about the need for a revival which was something more than words. He was saying that you need to really go back into your ancestral past and discover things. So, although he spoke in favor of the demolition of the Babri Masjid, and that was a notorious interview he gave in Times of India, I think, actually, after that happened. He was always, he was not exactly an intellectual backer of the BJP, and very often when he had encounters with people from the party, he said things which they were very offended by. So as ever with Naipaul, there's some ambiguity.
well, the Hindu right wing is also notoriously easy to offend.
Yeah, and I think they shared some of his critique of Islam. I mean, one of his problems with societies like Pakistan is the idea that they show the zeal of the convert, and that it's therefore, as Naipaul sees it, not authentically rooted in the soil of Pakistan. And this is something the BJP will be very attracted by as an argument, because they also have this notion of what is authentic to the Indian soil, which is their view of Hinduism, and they tend to reject, therefore, Islam as an alien interposition, which is implicitly Naipaul's position as well. So that seems to me more the convergence. I'm sure Patrick is right, that when he spoke in revivalist terms, he wanted to revive something much more profound than building a kitschy new temple on the site of a disputed mosque,
Right,
or whatever.
quite. Yeah, and this is something that's haunted him for a while, right? Isn't Wounded Civilization about Vijayanagar and sort of the longing for its past glory? So, I mean, again, he anticipated many of us, or many of our political opponents on this count. Does someone already have the mic, or can I pick? Preferences will be given to women.
Yeah, we haven't had too many women, have we?
Yeah, but if there aren't any of you, the gentleman in the green in the center of the auditorium. Yeah. We can hear you if the mic's not working.
Hold the mic closer, though. Give it a try.
Yeah, give it a try.
Yeah. So there's the idea of a single story. How a single story can't truly represent a multi-dimensional society or culture. And because of a single story, we get some misconceptions or stereotypes. Like West has the stereotype that India is the land of beggars and snake charmers, or Bollywood is just about big dance numbers. So in context of this thing, does a writer, especially a prominent one, hold any responsibility about when he's writing about any culture or any society? Like in case of V.S. Naipaul, he must have some bitter experiences when he visited India. So he was kind of hostile towards Indian culture and all that. So does a prominent writer hold any responsibility in such scenario?
I think that's the question that vexes a lot of people when they try to wrestle with Naipaul's work, which is that they feel like he should be more responsible and not play the role of the provocateur, which he takes
This is
up.
going back to the empathy point, isn't
Quite-
it? I mean, I think he's raised an interesting issue, which you can almost appreciate with reference to another writer. I don't know how many of you have read Ruth Pror Jhabwala. But it's very
figures
striking
in-
how much she despises India And yet she writes obsessively only about India. And this sort of very conscious lack of sympathy. I mean, as a writer, I'm troubled. If I dislike something so much, would I be able to get into it enough to be able to write in a way that others will want to read it? She writes very well, I'm not knocking that, but the dislike comes through. In the case of Naipaul, so much of what he writes is savagely negative, isn't it? And the portrayal of the, I don't know, Patrick, you've read so much of Naipaul.
Play us out, Patrick.
Okay, so I don't think I think it is not accurate to say that Naipaul was hostile to Indian culture or to Indian society. I think that a lot of the writing that he did about India, which extended across 50 years, was a constant return to a country that he wanted to be part of, that he felt that he came from, that he wanted to rediscover, and that he wanted to participate in. And actually what he writes about India in the last decade or so of his life tends to be warmer and more complimentary. But I think that the early years and the early books came from the fact that he was returning in his late 20s, in his 30s, to become part of his ancestral homeland, and he felt that he was not accepted. He felt that he was anonymous, that the country was indifferent to him. Now you can say, well, he displayed great artistic arrogance in that sense, but essentially it was trying to understand a country that in certain ways he loved.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you all. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you, Patrick, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you, Supriya. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Supriya.
Thank you so much for this enlightening session.